It's a question about the Islamicity of the concept of consciousness. It's an interesting question. In contemporary Arabic, I guess that consciousness is represented by something akin to the idea of wa'i, that not only do we have senses, but we have the responsibility to process the information supplied by those senses. So the Holy Quran says, وَلِتَعْيَهَا أُذُنٌ وَاعِيَةٌ, so that a conscious ear might hear them. Very often we don't correctly process information supplied to us from the outside world. There isn't what the ancients used to call al-hiss al-mushtarak, which was the sensus communis, which was that part of the human consciousness or mind which took on board the enormous amount of information that's fed to us by the five senses and filters out that which is extraneous. So that part of consciousness on that basic level is that the sense of sight might feed to us in every instant thousands of individual pieces of information, but there is something in the mind that filters out everything that's irrelevant so that, as it were, the system doesn't crash. That's the most basic element of consciousness, which is a material function, essentially what they would call al-hiss al-mushtarak. But higher than that, there is the subtle aspect of the apperception of subjects, which is the way in which memory, al-quwwat al-hafizah in the traditional Islamic vocabulary, is aligned with this capacity to filter out and filter in information supplied from the outside world, and to engage that with the ruh, the spirit. And that is a very subtle thing. That the hardest thing to speak about in traditional religion is the nature of the soul. Imam al-Ghazali says that this is something tahayyara fihi al-aktharun. Most people are bewildered by it. And the Quran itself says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the ruh. They went to the Holy Prophet ﷺ and asked him about this ruh. What is it that's the essence of our perception, of having perceptions in the world and of processing decisions? What is it? قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. The spirit is of the command of my Lord, and of knowledge you have been given but little. And in contemporary philosophy of mind, the definition of consciousness turns out to be the hardest of all issues. The issue of artificial intelligence nowadays, for instance, is very much on the philosophical agenda. Endless conferences about the possibility of the internet, for instance, acquiring consciousness. What happens if the internet, which is now at least as complex as the average human brain, one day acquires consciousness and actually starts to communicate with us? And philosophers often talk about that, and sometimes theologians as well. What happens if one day, for instance, I get an email from the internet itself, and the internet says, at 3 o'clock this morning I achieved consciousness, and I've looked at all of the information about religions that are stored on my database, and I have a lot of information, and I've decided I want to take Shahada, so what should I do? It's the kind of idea that philosophers of mind are playing with at the moment. Generally, the view seems to be that there's no sign of consciousness appearing in purely mechanical structures such as the internet. That however intricate the internet becomes and how well it seems able to reproduce many of the workings of the human brain in terms of the selection of data and the storage of data, it is still a million miles away from achieving that mysterious thing that we call consciousness. There's no sign that the internet or any other artificial or robotic intelligence is capable of acquiring that most mysterious thing. And that is really the sirr al-adamiyya, that is the secret of humanity and the secret of allama Adam al-asma'a kullaha. He taught Adam all of the names. That there is a sense in which a device, a mechanical substrate, cannot be taught the names, because those names have ethical dimensions which presuppose really enfleshment in a body. Justice and mercy and nurturing and all of those things are specific to humanity, and they are part of our consciousness. So just to sum that up, one could say that the nearest we can get to a definition of consciousness in our traditional understanding is that it is that thing that we acquire when we follow the prophetic commandment, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, acquire the qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that left to our own devices, we have certain bestial tendencies in which we share with the world of the Baha'im, the animals, and even the plants, which don't have a consciousness in any kind of recognizable human sense, because they're not capable of moral processing. To the extent that we overcome that nafs hayawaniya or nafs bahimiya and acquire something that is higher, a nafs al-natiqa, the articulate, the logical, the discursive soul, which is through acquiring these qualities that are in the divine and are not intrinsic in the world, then we acquire the mystery of consciousness. And it's very important as an aspect of spiritual growth as well, that not to have a consciousness is in a sense to be an animal, even to be dead. And to have a consciousness is to be alive and to really be an agent in the world, in the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes us to be, which is the sirr of the khilafah in this world. Only Adam, alayhi salam, has that capacity, despite the fact that he sheds blood and yufsidu fiha, causes corruption in it. His descendants can do that, but the angels are still commanded to bow down to him. Why is that? Because he has this ruh within him and this capacity to be activated by these divine names that make him, in this mysterious, extraordinary way, a legitimate qibla for the angels, which is, again, one of the ways in which the Holy Quran explains this mystery of the ruh. It is the ruh which is from the affair of Allah that these angels are bowing down to. Fully conscious human beings are realized human beings through having acquired their theomorphic properties in terms of recovering their Adamic perfection. To the extent that we have those names of justice, of strength, of mercy, of gentleness, those divine qualities within ourselves in due balance, we actually have an activated higher consciousness. To the extent that those things are out of balance or not activated at all, then we're just part of the material world. But it's a good question, because I think ultimately human language cannot come up with an adequate definition of that thing which is the most mysterious phenomenon that we experience in the world, namely the mystery that not only is there a universe out there, but that the universe is knowable and that it can be appropriated and understood. And actually Professor Guidardoni, a couple of weeks ago when he came to Cambridge, talked about these galaxies and showed us pictures of the Hubble deep fields and talked about these extraordinary things, said that the deepest mystery of it all for the cosmologist is not the fact that the universe is there and so multiple and so brilliant and so orderly, but the fact that it can be understood. That's where science really breaks down, that there can be a consciousness that actually sees the universe and seeks to understand it and to appropriate it. So that again is وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You've only been given a little knowledge. Thank you for that. Well, we are, in a sense, under occupation. The basic kind of infrastructure of the modern world is determined by another set of values. But the believers have been under such situations in the past, and in a sense it's a test of their faith that they continue to connect themselves to what's authentic and what is prophetic, despite the fact that the powers that be might have been seduced by or have had imposed upon them values that are alien to the prophetic original model. And it's happened so often in our history that for centuries we have existed under alien systems, whether it be under the Inquisition in Spain or under the emperors in China or elsewhere. And Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam endured and indeed flourished in his prophetic vocation in Egypt, despite the fact that it was a pharaonic political and religious system. And that the fact that the infrastructure is alien to us shouldn't be something that burdens us with an intolerable challenge, because it frequently is the lot of the believer that he exists as a stranger in a world that is inimical to his systems. And the fact that certain people who are in positions of power have been seduced by the language of the powerful is something that always happens in history, and again is completely unsurprising, and in the long term turns out to come to nothing. وَأَمَّا الطَّيِّبُ فَيَمْكُثُ فِي الْأَرْضِ, the Quran says, that which is pure and good remains in the earth, and that which is corrupt, فَيَذْهَبُ غُثَاء, it just goes like foam or like froth. And that which is prophetic and rooted in the fitrah and rooted in people's real needs is that which eventually will prevail. And one reason why we're now seeing in the West so many people, despite the regnant quality of the structures of modernity, turning to Islam, and it's happening, as I said last night, with increasing rapidity, people just contacting me and others out of the blue and asking for Islam, is that people have seen through the system by understanding the system and want something that's more authentic. People see in Islam the only surviving, authentic spiritual technology from a great age of faith. That despite the fact that so many external aspects of our infrastructure might have been subverted, internally we haven't been subverted in terms of our basic practices. That nobody has yet fiddled with the 5 daily prayers, that nobody has yet interfered with the rules for Ramadan and those other things. The core practices, the arkan of Islam, are intact in a way that they are not in other religions. You go into a mosque anywhere in the world and what you see is a faithful attempt to reproduce the worship of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and the ibadah is more or less united with trivial differences between the madahib. If you go into a place of worship of any other religion, what you will not see is the way in which the founder of that religion worshipped. In some cases, people have no idea that that might be an interesting thing to try and reproduce. And the divisions amongst them are gigantic. So it is true that on certain political and economic levels, people who are of dunya have been psychically manipulated by the powers that be. But that happens frequently in history. What we really need to hold on to and celebrate, and that which eventually will ensure our success, is the intactness of our aqidah and the intactness of our basic practices. And you have no idea with what relief people come to Islam and find that the basic acts of worship in our mosque have not been tampered with by well-meaning but superficial reformers, that they find an ancient, intact ritual from a great age of faith that nobody has fiddled with. And this is an extraordinary blessing that very often people who are born and bred in Muslim countries just take for granted without thinking what an extraordinary miracle this is, which is part of the وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, that we truly are preservers of it. The basic core of the religion is, despite the distractedness and the weakness of so many Muslims and Muslim leaders, still intact, and we need to be, I think, more thankful for that. Wallahu a'lam. What human beings crave generically is a sense of security, a sense that relationships will endure, a sense that their culture has a future, and a sense that life has meaning. And all of those things have really collapsed amongst non-Muslims in the last 50 years, with the collapse of church attendance, for instance. In the 1950s, 60% of the population went to church on Sundays. Now it's about 3 or 4%. It's an unprecedented collapse. We've become one of the most secular countries on earth. And that necessarily produces an enormous crisis in people's souls, and they think that there is nothing after death, there is no meaning, there's no basis to the ethical decisions that they take. But the BBC programme also came to some other conclusions which have to do with issues of the way in which children are brought up. And the one thing that they did indicate was that psychologists believe that human happiness has a lot to do with the security that they felt when they were small children. And the thing that they pinpointed most consistently was the fact that even though on their sort of evolutionary model, the norm for the human young is to be brought up in the context of a family where the woman is primarily responsible for the nurturing of young children, that being the historic norm of our species. Increasingly nowadays, children as young as 3 and 4 are actually handed over to the state or to various organizations, and they may spend the entire day being looked after by employees, which apparently provides a deep sense of insecurity in children that is perpetuated in later life, because they don't have that deep sense of bonding with the mother who is genetically committed to their welfare. It's quite interesting because that's very much against a certain type of sort of feminist orthodoxy that wants to free up women to go out to work and to allow childcare to be done institutionally. But nonetheless, they were forced to report on that, something that for the psychologists does seem to be objectively a reason why so many people are kind of insecure, so many teenagers rebel. There are suicidal tendencies amongst many young people, many young women cutting themselves, mutilating themselves, experiencing various dietary disorders because of this deep insecurity that apparently relates in large measure to the fact that as little kids they didn't have the absolute maximum security of being cared for all the time by their own mothers. Those are two very big questions. For the first one, it's true there's a fascinating range of hadith that seem to impute some kind of consciousness to even objects and rocks. For instance, the hadith, which is a sound hadith, where the Holy Prophet ﷺ says, "Uhudun jabalun yuhibbuna wa nuhibbu." Uhud is a mountain which loves us and which we love. And that wasn't just stated as some kind of poetic excess. That is something that has to mean something, and love is something that appears if there is a kind of consciousness. It doesn't have to be human consciousness. You can say, "My dog loves me," for instance, and that's a meaningful statement, without the dog really having anything like a ruh or a capacity to make moral decisions and to have a human type of consciousness. And the ulama, and Imam Nawawi, again in his commentary on Sahih Muslim, has some useful things to say here, says that the zahir of these hadith is that Allah at that moment creates a tamyiz, a kind of discernment in those entities. That it is possible for something in the created order that isn't human to have a kind of consciousness, which is why the Mount Uhud can love the Holy Prophet ﷺ. And also in the case of the animal world, we know that one of the distinctive features of the Sunnah is kindness to animals. And the وَلَكُمْ فِي كُلِّ كَبِدٍ رَطْبٍ أَجْرٌ, that the Holy Prophet ﷺ is asked, shall we be rewarded for kindness shown to animals? And he says, you'll be rewarded for a kindness done to every wet or moist liver, which means a kind of animal rather than a plant or an insect. And there's a number of hadiths like that, and that wouldn't really make much sense, that there could be ihsan to a living thing if it didn't have some kind of consciousness and ability genuinely to interpret the fact that it was experiencing pain in a way that, for instance, a plant couldn't. So Imam Nawawi says, yes, there is a tamyiz in those things, and there's many stories of ulama who have been able in some sense to communicate mysteriously with animals and to have a particular relationship with animals. And some of my own teachers were able to do that. One of my teachers was well known in East Africa. If animals came out of the forest and were terrifying people, or if cows had broken out of their enclosure and were lost in the forest, they would send for him, even though he was a kind of old man with a stick, because they knew he could just stand in the field and somehow, in an hour or so, those natural forms would be back in their appropriate place. And many Muslim cultures have experience of people who are able to do that. But that's not ruh. That's not really consciousness in the sense that human beings can have it, that Adamic highest consciousness, that theomorphic consciousness of having all of the names. Because a rock or a cow or a bird can't have all of those qualities in the sense that human beings can have them. And Sayyidina Adam had them, and you can't imagine the angels bowing down to the rock or to the bird or to the cat or the camel. They are a different order of creation. But still, in terms of, say, Lovelace's Gaia hypothesis that the world itself is some kind of living thing, it is certainly at an opposite pole from an animistic or pagan idea that says that there are spirits conscious in kind of trees and rocks and rivers and things. But nonetheless, we also believe that Allah in His omnipotence is capable of giving the miracle of discernment of some kind that our kinds of minds are unimaginable to those things. And it's philosophically linked to the question of, for instance, in Oxford there's the philosopher Richard Sorabji who's written on this, to what extent is an animal consciousness imaginable to a human consciousness? For instance, if I injure a cat and the cat is feeling pain, can I genuinely analogize with the pain that I would feel if something similar had happened to myself? And on a basic neurological level one can, but in terms of other feelings of sort of humiliation and despair that might be consequent upon the injury, it's rather harder to make the analogy. And it continues to be a problem in animal rights philosophy, for instance, the extent to which animal consciousness is genuinely analogous to human consciousness. And it may well be something that we're not ever able to prove. Radical human rights activists like Peter Singer, for instance, radical vegetarians and others will say it's analogous to human consciousness. It has nothing to do with what's in your memory or your ability to conceptualize these things. It's consciousness that's affected. Therefore, we shouldn't eat animals. The majority of philosophers have taken a different view. Animal consciousness is of a different and subordinate kind. The other question really is about the question of the transcendence, the tanzih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what a certain type of Orientalist tends to miss is the fact that the Quran itself speaks of the divine in two different registers which are complementary. That on the one hand there is the absolute tanzih, laysa kamithlihi shay', nothing is like him. There can be no valid analogy between finite things and the infinite source of those things, because there's no common measure between the finite and the infinite. But on the other hand, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of himself as having a hand, as having a face, as being possessed of quasi-human personal attributes such as he is as-sabur, he is ar-rashid, al-halim, concepts that, if they have any content at all, must indicate that there is some kind of analogy that exists between human virtues and qualities and the qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows to his creation. And those two registers in the Quran operate together in the interpretations of the greatest of our thinkers. Most of our thinkers have kept them separate, so that Kalam overwhelmingly deals with the God of Laysa kamithlihi shay', and it's all knowledge of what God is by inference from what God cannot be, a negative theology, the nafi, tariq al-nafi. Whereas the way of tasawwuf, which is the other great way in which Muslims have done metaphysics, has been focused on the God of tashbih, the God who is aqrabu ilayhi min hablil warid, closer to him than the jugular vein. And the whole genre of Sufism, which is expressed in poetry, is overwhelmingly about Allah as the beloved, the one who can be known, and one lifts her veil and seeks to be united with the beloved. And there's a very kind of concrete imagery there that is also an authentic continuation of that other tashbih-oriented Quranic way of discoursing about the divine. The greatest thinkers in our history have been those who have been able to see how those two fit together. Imam al-Ghazali is the one whose views have been best received amongst the ulama. But Ibn Arabi is the one who has theorized most boldly about it. And in his context he would be speaking about the divine essence as having two modalities. There is the that, the essence of the essence, which is the unknowable other, the infinity which our finiteness can never accurately or meaningfully speak about. But there is also the that al-asma', which is the divine essence which has attributes, which has qualities, which is equally a valid way of speaking about the divine, which is the divine as oriented towards the world, the divine that has qualities that are manifested in the created order and most evidently and perfectly in human beings, and al-insan al-kamil, through whom we can intuit the nature of the divine. In Ibn Arabi, the ultimate reality of God is unknowable to ourselves, but we can intuit the path to that reality through seeing the divine qualities, and those divine qualities are most perfectly manifested in the perfected human being, the highest manifestation of which is a prophetic figure. Which is why the concept of wilaya in Islam is so vitally important. Ibn Arabi doesn't deny the possibility of a rational definition of the divine, although he's a little bit cursory about it. But what he insists on is that our experience of the divine is through a deep human intuition of the qualities of God as divine qualities when we confront them in this world, and particularly when we confront them in the person of the prophet or the saint, who has this extraordinary capacity just through his being, through his presence, through his adab, and through the spiritual fragrance of his presence, to persuade people's souls of the existence and the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says both of these are legitimate ways of speaking about the divine. The the essence of the essence, absolutely unknowable. The ama, the cloud, that which is beyond even the word of God. But there is also equally the God that has names, that is demonstrably the case, because in this world of shadows and zulumat, we see the names instantiated, and because they are names that are through tawqif, given in revelation rather than names that we ourselves have conjectured about, they are authentic names that indicate or point towards the divine. they do not encompass the totality of the divine, but they are genuine pointers towards the divine, which is what we need. So they are useful for our suluk. But the end point of our suluk in Ibn Arabi's system is the realization that is beyond even the world of asma. And he would see that, although it sounds like a controversial view, as being a kind of Ash'ari insistence. That the famous Ash'ari formulation is that is not the same as his names, but is not other than the names. In other words, you can say it both ways. You can say Allah is not the same as his names, but you can also say Allah is his names. Those are both valid formulations. And in divinis, in the divine nature, that's not a contradiction. Contradictions are part of the created world and part of the way he has determined logic to operate. In his own self, he can do as he wills, and that's not an inherent contradiction. The reality of that is something that, for Ibn Arabi at any rate, has to come through mukashafa or unveiling. But he expresses it in this kind of discursive way so that the likes of us can start to intuit the way towards it. But Ibn Arabi, despite the elaborateness of his exposition, and its sometimes controversial form in the eyes of many of the ulama, is somebody who believes that dhawq is the way genuinely to resolve these things. How is it that God is the same as his names, but other than his names? Well, go and see for yourself, is his basic message. Thank you. I'm glad that we're now talking about practical things that we can take away with us. The Holy Prophet ﷺ passed away, and before he did so, there were two things that he insisted upon when he was on his deathbed, which we need to think about very carefully. When he was ill, he would say, as-salat, as-salat, the prayer, the prayer. And the other thing that he said was, usikum bin nisa'i khayra, I urge you to be good to women. Those are the two things which he wished the ummah to remember as he took leave of this world. And it seems to me that that is something that we need to put at the center of our practice of the religion at the moment. That at the prayer, if only the ummah was genuinely praying 5 times a day, with all that that implies in terms of the purity and the orientation and the centrality of the masjid, and leaving behind the rest of the world, genuinely meaning it when you say Allahu Akbar, our situation would be very different. And if only we heeded the prophetic advice, Usikum bin nisa'i khayra, be kind to women, our family life would be a lot better than it currently is. One can talk until one is blue in the face about ways in which the Sharia should be preserved or interpreted or reinterpreted, but unless there is compassion and respect, no amount of reform is going to make a difference. The reason why there are problems in relationships in Muslim communities, although not, as far as I can see, as much as they exist in non-Muslim communities. In England now we have calamitous social circumstances, with single parenthood becoming a norm in much of the country now, and most marriages ending in divorce. The reason why there is that mess is basically because of a lack of compassion and empathy and selflessness, that the modern world teaches us so much to esteem ourselves and to see what is in a situation for ourselves, that we tend to treat marriage in the same way, and that we tend to see a partner as just another opportunity of showing off, feeling good about ourselves, having new opportunities, rather than treating it as an opportunity for service, and as the believer should, to see that there is another soul there with insecurities that needs that need to be listened to and validated. If only we could understand that, I think that aspect of our situation would be ameliorated, and we wouldn't hear all of these problems about polygamy and talaq laws and things which are not to do with the laws themselves, but are to do with the hard-heartedness of so many people, particularly men. The Sharia is an expression of Allah's rahmah, and those who come to it from outside soon realize that we do need those boundaries. But unless it is treated as an adjunct to one's spiritual life, rather than just as a whole list of possible indulgences for men, which can't be a possible religious outlook, then we're going to make a mess of it. So those are the two things that I think we need to remember. First of all, the importance of the prayer for ourselves and for our families and for our communities and for everybody, so that the world looks at us as being a community of worshippers. and is amazed by that. And secondly, that we need to have this kindness to women, that is what the Holy Prophet really was about, the last thing that he enjoined us to remember, which we so often get wrong. Wallahu a'lam.
Did you count 4 questions or 3? Maybe I missed one.
Anyway, I'll go to the 3 that I understood, and then if there's another one, inshallah, we can come back to you. The question of sa'ada, there's worldly happiness and there is unworldly happiness. I think that we are all aware, if we have any kind of prayer life, that there is a distinction between the two. That when we have been given, through no merit of our own, a particular hal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that our instinct is to wish to bring happiness to other people. And that is the quality of the wali or the nabi. He wishes the other to be sa'id as well as himself. It's like the quality of the person who is in love, who is he loves his betrothed or his beloved so much that he's just full of benignness towards the rest of the world, and he wishes them to experience happiness as well, which is why that is actually a religious rather than a profane state. But the dunyawi happiness, which we get, for instance, if we inherit some money or win the lottery or some other material thing, generally takes the form of an element of schadenfreude or happiness that other people are missing out on that. I'm the one who has won the lottery and my neighbour didn't. Elements of satisfied envy are usually part of it. So very briefly, to differentiate between the two, an authentic religious happiness, a calm in the soul, which is the akhirah, is one that we long to share with others and brings us to greater respect and love for others, whereas a worldly happiness is something that makes us feel superior to others, as so many rich people do. So there is, inshallah, a clear distinction in terms of the state of mind that ensues. The question of how we identify ilham and determine its authenticity is, of course, a very subtle one, a very difficult one. And in istikhara prayer, very often we're not quite sure whether the response that we seem to have received is actually a consequence of the istikhara or not. One of the qualities of the awliya is that they are able, through their spiritual refinement, to determine what is a genuine khatir or thought from beyond, from that which comes from the nafs or from some other source, perhaps even a demonic source. That's one reason why we need to cultivate ourselves and to overcome the nafs, because the more we overcome the nafs, the more able we are spiritually to differentiate between genuine angelic inspirations and those which are from the ego. The question of the treatment of mental illness and the relevance of using sort of pharmaceuticals in treating such complaints is again a difficult issue, and not just for believers. A friend of mine recently in the north of England had been diagnosed as a schizophrenic at least 15 years ago and given some very powerful drugs. And indeed, he did seem to have all of the symptoms of schizophrenia, and these seemed, if anything, to sort of get worse, although they seemed to be mitigated slightly when he was on the medication. He became dangerously violent. He would have to be sectioned in a hospital in Manchester, and his life was very miserable. His relationship broke down. His spiritual life was a calamity. And then one day, just maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he decided that he was going to stop taking all of these medicines altogether because he felt they weren't making him better. And he became worse for a while, but now he's more or less recovered. And now the men in white coats seem to think that probably most of his disturbance was actually caused by these powerful chemicals that were messing up his brain. The function of the brain, and particularly the subtler aspects of it, to do with personality and ethics and delusion, are so subtle and ungraspable that modern medicine really doesn't understand how they work and really can't see how these powerful drugs make a difference. Overwhelmingly, the prescription of powerful drugs by psychiatrists and psychologists is on the basis of some kind of empirical or experimental evidence that these things seem to work. Treatment for manic depressives, for instance, lithium or lithium substitute. They don't really know how or why it works, but evidence seems to suggest that it does work, and so they continue to prescribe it. But given the delicate balance of the human brain and the subtle relationship, as we believers believe it holds with the spirit itself, generally, if one can avoid pharmaceutical solutions, much better to avoid it. That if there are ways of enhancing people's sense of self, their security, their prayer life, incorporating them properly into society, because very often mental disturbance is caused by loneliness and other things that are increasingly common in our atomized society. That's infinitely better than pumping them full of medication, which may have side effects that it could take a long time to identify, if ever. So those are my three answers. Have I missed your fourth question?
The fourth question is, some Western theorists say that subconscious mind will represent our conscious mind, which means subconscious mind will affect our conscious mind. How do you react with that statement? Some kind of theory from Western?
Well, if you look at dreams, for instance, which is where all kinds of things kind of bubble up to the surface, you'll see some kind of indication of this. And Imam al-Ghazali, when he talks about dreams, says that they're of different kinds. That there are some dreams which are, he basically identifies three types. There's the dream which is the recycling of memories of things that have happened to one recently or in the distant past. That the consciousness is just sort of turning them over and over again for reasons of its own and may break surface, and he says they have no spiritual significance. Second category is, he says, demonic inspirations, really kind of dark and ugly things that certain human beings can focus on, that obsessive, addictive behavior and interest in dark and dirty, impure things that sometimes can happen when we sleep, when inhibitions are lowered, sometimes even to people when they're awake. If they're not people who have sufficient self-discipline, they can find that they really are kind of fixed on the ugly. And there's a lot of modern art, for instance, tends to exploit that, our desire to see what's ugly, the intestine, the nudity of an ugly old person, or the kind of thing that the modern artist is preoccupied with is, for Imam al-Ghazali, an example of these khawatir shaytaniyah, the demonic impulsions. There's no rational reason or spiritual reason why we should want to look at somebody's dirt, but the modern artist is interested and wants us to be interested as well. And the third is the angelic inspiration, which is the ilham, which comes from a higher realm, which everybody kind of intuits in a weak way when they experience beauty. That the experience of seeing the sea or a beautiful painting or something inspires some higher possibility within them, but they usually don't have the ability to conceptualize that. But in its pure and intense form, it's the experience of the believer when they are confronted with the reality as a result of a lifetime of service to others and prayer and genuine, sincere activation of the religion. And that person may expect to receive a genuine ilham. It can sometimes happen that people can be given an intuition or an unveiling without apparently having done anything to deserve it. And this frequently seems to happen. And there, in many Muslim cultures, and no doubt in Malay culture, there are similar stories of people who seem to have led a bad life, but Allah gives them something inexplicably, and they become sort of people whose dua is always answered. There's a story of a well-known saint in Delhi 400 years ago in India, and he was known that if you went to him and asked for his dua, the prayer would always be answered, and people would go from all around India to ask for his dua, even though he was this wild man who just lived on the street, and his company would only be with the children on the street, and he would play with them, and he would ride sort of toy horses with them, and that was his life. And the Sultan Aurangzeb wanted to ask this saint how he'd achieved this extraordinary degree. And the saint said, "I'm not interested in visiting the Sultan if you refused all of the invitations." So eventually the Sultan lowered a net from the palace window and grabbed this saint as he was walking beneath and playing with the children, and grabbed him up and brought him in front of the throne. And he said, "I just have one question for you. How is it that you came to Allah?" And he said, "The same way I came to you." In other words, a net was lowered and I was pulled up. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And that kind of ilham through Allah's generosity can be given to people. They can repent. And I know somebody in England who told me an extraordinary story about how when he was only 14 years old, living as a non-Muslim in a part of England far from me, had a dream of a beautiful man who wore a green turban and had a smiling face. And when this teenager woke up, he felt that there was still some kind of interesting fragrance in the room. And he read and he read and he realized that it was Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he became Muslim and is now Hafiz of Quran, even though he's a convert to Islam. How that happened in his dream, this is part of the alam al-arwah, the secret world of the spirit consciousness, strange things that happen to people in sleeping or half-waking states, and Allahu a'lam as to how that works. But in Allah's generosity, anybody, even the likes of us, can hope one day to be pulled with Allah's net out of our dunya and given something better, inshallah. I suppose I briefly indicated this earlier when I indicated this prophetic category of the gharib, being a stranger. And I talked about the khalwat dar anjuman, the solitude in the crowd. Those of us who don't live even in Muslim cultures but in a Western unbelieving environment, such as the very secular university world that I inhabit, have constantly to deal with the fact that one is a fish out of water, and one needs to carry with oneself a kind of life support system in order to maintain the alternate worldview intact rather than be constantly influenced. And the mechanisms that are propounded for this are essentially at the root the mechanisms of the sunnah itself, because the sunnah is a style of life that is oriented towards our end time situation, our eschatological reality. The sunnah is designed not just for people who exist as comfortable members of flourishing sacred societies, but also people who are essentially in this situation of khalwat ar anjuman, being alone in the crowd, because everybody else has as their qibla the 10,000 things in the created world. A policy of that, an aspect of that is the prophetic haya, that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was a person of haya, of not being brazen, of constantly lowering his gaze. And this principle of nazar bar ghadam is something that is associated with the khalwat dar anjuman principle, that one looks towards one's feet. One is not, like everybody else, looking in the shop windows and looking at the cars and looking at all of the stuff that's around, but constantly involved with what is important in one's own internal life while remaining part of the society. Khush dardam is another principle, which means remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every breath. The name of Allah actually is the way we breathe, so that there are never opportunities for the shaitan or the distraction to creep in and to delude us with alternate worldviews, because his presence is constant with us. And the consequence of that for the mashayikh is safar barbatan, which is travelling to the homeland. If we know that our destination is the akhirah, and we map out our lives and our careers and our career choices on that basis, rather than on the basis of shallow, material, egotistic status, then inshallah the intention will carry us through. But of course we're weak and we are osmotic creatures. At-taba' salim sarraq, the sound human nature is a thief, which means that we're always influenced by the akhlaq and the qualities and the worldview of people who are around us. That's the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created human beings. We have that osmotic quality. And the solution to that is, as much as possible, although one might have profane people to associate with at one's place of work, to ensure that one's home environment and one's social circles are made up of people who are remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a joyful and a classical way. But of course it's difficult, and many people do disappear beneath the waves and submerge, because dunya and the modern systems are powerful, and many people are kind of magicked away by the sophistication of secular discourses of various kinds, because of the weakness of their spiritual life, or because their teachers have not been able to explain certain shubhas that might appear intellectually, because their teachers themselves might not have a sufficient grasp of modernity and the weaknesses of modernity. But as I indicated earlier, the Enlightenment fundamentalism that one found in the universities a few decades ago has largely melted away. The place of theology and a sacred vision in the universities is much stronger and more respected than it used to be. Certainly in the major Western universities, Yale and Harvard, theology is thriving. Post-critical hermeneutics is a major philosophical tendency now that uses scripture as one of its major interlocutors. The science has changed to make much more space for the possibility of a divine ground for being. Things are a lot easier for us conceptually, although they might have become more difficult for us socially in the modern academic world. And alhamdulillah, we see that there's now a thriving Muslim intellectual community in major Western universities in a way that even 20 or 30 years ago would have seemed inconceivable. The large number of Muslims who are in Islamic studies, which say in the 1960s and 70s were really monopolized by Christians, Jews and secularists of various kinds. You see, in every Islamic studies faculty now in the Western world, there is at least one Muslim, active Muslim, and often several Muslims in place. These are all signs that the modern academic environment can be a useful sort of ecosystem for Muslim inhabitation, as long as Muslims are sufficiently aware of their own tradition and of the nature and the strengths and the weaknesses of modernity. There's arguable assumptions in both of those questions, I think. The first is that so many Muslims hate Imam al-Ghazali, and generally haven't found that to be the case. Nobody denies the immensity of Imam al-Ghazali's contribution in the science of usul al-fiqh, for instance. Mustasfa is a text that's respected and studied by people from virtually all orientations. Imam al-Ghazali was, as everybody can see, the man who most comprehensively defeated the unacceptable dimensions of Greek philosophy. The man who came up with the most successful refutation of the Ta'limiyya, the Ismailis, the one who wrote the most successful refutation of Christianity. His contribution is not doubted by serious scholars. In fact, as I indicated last night, Imam al-Suyuti, in his fatwa on the meaning of the concept of tajdeed in Islam, says that although there are differences of opinion as to who was the mujaddid of the Islamic world in different centuries, he says he doesn't know anybody who disagrees with the fact that Imam al-Ghazali was the mujaddid of his century. Imam al-Suyuti is writing about 4 centuries later on, in a time of really great scholarship, particularly in hadith. And he says, "La a'lamu lahu khilafa." Everybody agrees that Imam al-Ghazali was the renewer of his age. And the title that is given is Hujjat al-Islam, which is not a title given to any other thinker in the Sunni context. There are some individuals who nowadays have come out against him, but overwhelmingly those are people from the fringes of the Ummah, intellectually speaking. These are people who are not legitimately connected to any valid chain of authority. These are people who are modernists who basically wish Islam to be just another variant on the modern principle, and regard Imam al-Ghazali's focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as anachronistic. Or there are people who are ultra-literalists who think that Imam al-Ghazali's selective incorporation of aspects of philosophy and tasawwuf into Islam is something that was unnecessary. But what we're seeing now, I think, is a transformation in that. If you look at the history of the Islamic movement over the last quarter century, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a tremendous upsurge of interest in Islam amongst young people across the Muslim world. It was a kind of spontaneous combustion everywhere from Malaysia to Morocco to wherever a revival took place, the Sahwa. That Sahwa very often was based more on emotion and identity than on any kind of deep reflection. The theological productions of those revivalist movements were generally emotive rather than analytical. I think that the newer generation of the Muslims now has seen that particular movement has kind of run out of steam, that the ideology of Islamism in that kind of 1980s way is no longer so popular amongst the younger generation, partly because it doesn't seem to have supplied very much, but has actually helped the Ummah, and has in some cases produced forms of violent extremism that clearly have produced disasters for the Muslims. But also I think because there's a greater maturity now and a desire that people don't just operate with their hearts but with their minds as well. They want to understand Islam and to see why they're Muslim rather than just be Muslim because that's something that they've been born into. So I think that although the age of huge demonstrations and mass Islamist movements is probably behind us now, we're entering a better period in which people are actually thinking more and reincorporating the totality of Islam. As Imam Siraj Hendricks says, Imam al-Ghazali was somebody who saw Islam as something in his age which was fragmented and broken into lots of different pieces. And he showed how, using a correct understanding, the real Islamic aql, one could see how fiqh fits with usul al-fiqh, which fits with tasawwuf, which fits with kalam, which fits with tafsir, and reintegrated Islam into a single vision. That, I think, is what Muslim thinkers are trying to do now, in the light of the perhaps more difficult challenge of engaging with secular modernity. But that is the way in which I see the more reflective young Muslim activists moving now. That we're not regarding the Islamism of the 1980s and the early 90s as just a disaster and a failure. But it wasn't the last stage. We're moving on to something else which is, I think, deeper and more reflective, and something that can actually put us in a much better position to do da'wah. The old Islamism was a kind of conflictual, we're against the West, Muslim tribalism, more often than not. I think we're moving on from that by seeing ways in which we can express ourselves in Western languages, in Western categories of thought, that can actually bring people into Islam much more than was possible, say, in the time of Sayyid Qutb and Maududi and some of the writers who were writing for the needs of an earlier generation. So I think that in this new context, Imam al-Ghazali is being rediscovered by the new generation and treated with much more respect and seriousness than was the case in a lot of Islamic activist circles, say, 20 years ago. Sorry, what was your second question?
Touches of the modern medication. As we know, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the key components of globalization. Does this point to the fact that more and more human are godless, or is it because of lack of meaning?
Yeah, this is another thing that everybody is alarmed about. The extent to which chemical intervention can alter our consciousness, and the explosion in the global use of narcotics is just one visible expression of that. People are not happy with the way they are and the way they're thinking, so they want some kind of chemical stimulation. In many British universities now, we're trying to work out what to do with the fact that many students, as they face their exams, are now taking performance-enhancing drugs, which are actually designed for people with dementia, Alzheimer's, degenerative diseases, because it enhances memory. And it's demonstrably the case that if you take these pills before your exam, you get a better grade because your memory is enhanced. So even at my university, we're not quite sure what to do about that. Do we have compulsory drugs testing for students as they go into the exam? How can we police this? It's part of a larger crisis, I think, in human subjectivity. And the philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote a recent book which claims that ours is the last generation of humanity as traditionally understood, because our technical capacity for manipulating the basis of human subjectivity is unparalleled. We can now, through cosmetic surgery, change the way we look any way that we want. Through genetic manipulation, we are increasingly able to change the basic constitution of our human reality and to create new forms. For instance, a friend of mine who's a geneticist was recently approached by the Pentagon with a request that he carry out theoretical research on the possibility of producing a human being who can breathe underwater. It's illegal to create somebody like that, they use that word, but the theoretical research is legal and they wanted to pay him to do this. And he had some interesting questions about what that would mean for the Sharia, for instance. If such a person was a Muslim but had gills and could breathe underwater, how would they fast during Ramadan? And I had no idea how to answer those questions, but as the years progress and human beings become more used to the idea of radical redefinition of the species, not just through pharmaceuticals but through genetic engineering, these are going to be the questions that we ask. And Habermas's point is that everything in the humanities is going to be changed by these scientific transformations, because the humanities, from literature to art to psychology to sociology to philosophy, have always assumed that the one thing that didn't change was human beings, that we are the same beings that we were at the time of Socrates, Aristotle, Moses. If we're something new, if we're transhuman, everything has to be new for us. So he's proposing that we're on the brink of the end of humanity, and he thinks that for utilitarian and ethical reasons, these scientific changes will sooner or later be put into practice. We'll all live to be 1,000 years old, we'll all be able to see in the dark, and we'll be something totally different, because that's what we'll want, and human beings tend to get what they want if the scientific options are there. So yeah, pharmaceuticals is one aspect of it, but there are deeper questions which are raised for religion, including Islam, by modernity, in that we now have this ability to change our identities, to change what we are, to reassign our genders, to do very fundamental things to ourselves, which is part of the postmodern condition of not having a fixed identity, but being in this constant state of flux.
The Quran emphasizes the polarity of the genders. This is fundamental to its vision.
لَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, the male is not like the female, and Allah's signs tend to alternate. And وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. From his signs is that he created spouses from your own kind, that you might feel at peace in them. Part of our vision of the cosmos is that everything is the consequence of the interplay of opposites, and human society, human spirituality is part of that. One of the axioms of the modern world really is that it has to unbalance anything that traditionally was in balance, and that everywhere in the world, and not just in Malaysia, you find that there are extreme disparities. Perhaps in the West we have done this earlier, and we have had more chance to reflect on the consequences. I've already indicated this rather unfashionable BBC survey that indicated that there does seem to be a strong genetic interest in children being brought up intensively by their mothers when they're small. And many people increasingly in the Western world are recognizing this, that their fitra has not been completely suffocated. Germaine Greer is somebody who we have actually with us in Cambridge. I see her from time to time, and she's been a very interesting, conscientious reflector on the gender paradox, having written The Female Eunuch, which in the late 60s, early 70s was one of the great manifestos of women's liberation and encouraging women to do everything that men were doing to enter the universities and the professions. 30 years later, she published another book called The Whole Woman, in which she says that some problems, particularly those to do with male arrogance and ego, have been largely overcome, but we are facing a whole range of new problems now, and the evidence is that women are no happier than they were, and in many ways are unhappier. And it's quite interesting hearing that from somebody who was one of the pioneers of the feminist movement in the 60s. That there are new problems that women confront, such as the gigantic size of the global pornography industry, such as the fashion industry, which tends to be experienced as very oppressive by a lot of young women, the preoccupation with appearance, with dieting, the endless preoccupation with appearance and cosmetic surgery as another uncontrollable growth industry amongst the young. That really isn't a solution either. And that in the longer term, I think we will have to recall that the prophetic message is ultimately not about being politically correct in an achievement-oriented society, but in lovingly recognizing the differences that exist between the genders, and that the Islamic norm, whether the age likes it or not, is preponderantly for the female principle to be the domestic principle, and the principle that has the energy and the nurturing skills to look after the very young, and that the male principle is the principle whose natural habitat is outside the home and in the workplace. That was a view that was more or less blasphemous to express even 20 years ago in the West, but is increasingly a view that is being taken by particularly thinking women who are genuinely suffering as a result of the disparities that have emerged. There is no simple solution to it, but I think it's important that Muslims do recognize what is normative. It is, of course, the case that there is nothing in the Sharia that prevents women from being in university or in the professions, and they may well be able to make a genuine contribution and a service to society in that way. But we should not allow our awareness of the distinct creative genius of the two genders to be completely effaced by a modernity that is generally hostile to all kinds of difference in humanity, and that for marketing and economic reasons has an interest in reducing us all to variance upon the same thing. That same globalization makes young people almost identical across the world, listening to the same music, wearing the same clothes, having the same outlook, is also narrowing the difference between the genders. And that's something that I think, for the sake of the richness of human diversity, which is one of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is something that we have to vigorously contest. And perhaps that's one reason why we find, in my own context in Cambridge, for instance, that about 9 out of 10 new Muslims are actually women. And they tend to be from extremely educated backgrounds. They're university students, they've got elite career pathways ahead of them. But they find that the modern approach really doesn't speak to them as women and as thinking spiritual beings. And they're looking for something very often a good deal more traditional. So these things tend to move in cycles. And maybe the disillusionment that you see in a lot of feminist writing now in the modern West is something that in 10 or 20 years will become normal in Malaysia and other places as well. Certainly it's something that we're working through. It's not that what is being recommended is a return to any given set of patterns from the past, but rather a certain caution about the huge claims that were made for the women's movement in its heyday in the 1970s and the 1980s, because new problems have emerged and society continues to fragment, and when it fragments it tends to be the women who carry the greater burden. Maybe it depends on what you understand by those Quranic verses that ask us to think about creation. وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Does that just mean that we intuit in a simple way the nature and the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just through a poetic regard for forms of creation? Or does it legitimize some kind of deeper probing into the way in which creation has been set up? I think probably both of those are legitimate. But religion, at least a universal religion like Islam, has to provide space for people who actually want to understand. It can't just in a fideistic way say, this is true because it's known in Revelation and science has nothing to do with it, and science changes anyway. I think it has to have a way of integrating both forms of knowledge. Because Allah's ayat, His signs, are there in Scripture, but He also has signs in the world. And just as we make tafsir of the Qur'an, we're entitled as thinking beings to make a tafsir of the way in which the physical world has been created. And the real mufassir will be able to show how those two things might cohere. Of course, there's no doctrinally fixed way in which that can happen, because the physics in particular does change. At the moment, the model is string theory and quantum mechanics, but it's quite feasible that in 20 or 50 years there'll be a completely different model available. But I think that for people who take current models seriously, often for good reason, because the equations seem to work and the empirical evidence seems to be present, there has to be a way in which that is positively related to the data of revelation. That one cannot ignore the facticity of scientific discoveries where they are demonstrable empirical discoveries. And here I think one could partially bracket out things like evolution, because evolution is not experimentally verifiable. There are ulama who have done things with Darwin, but it's not in the same category as what happens in a Large Hadron Collider, for instance, where you can repeat the experiment many times and see if the hypothesis can become scientific fact. So I believe that for those inquiring minds who are intrigued by modern physics and what we now appear to know about the nature of the created world, that those physics have to be related in an organic and sophisticated way to the metaphysics of Islam, rather than pretending that religion inhabits some completely detached realm of propositions, which very often can be a way of secularizing the sciences. I think that if you say religion has nothing to say about the material world that the sciences define, that's a near neighbor to saying that religion really doesn't have a clue, and that religion should just inhabit a devotional space in the mosques and it can't genuinely participate in the larger intellectual conversations of the modern world, which do take science as being a very important conversation partner. Anything is capable of subversion. It's not just banking, but it's, for instance, things like praying and believing and teaching that one can do for the wrong reason. One can use them to advance one's self-esteem, one can use them to impress others. Anything is capable of being subverted. So it is very often the case that the forms of the economic and political infrastructure proposed by various Islamist movements can become vehicles for egotism and oppression. And some of the leaders of, for instance, the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran in the last 30 years have been people who clearly were in it for reasons of personal gain, for cronyism, for supporting the employability of family members, for exploitation of various kinds. That's just human nature, I'm afraid. But Islam is ultimately optimistic about the reformability of the public realm. The fact that very often people engage in religion for the wrong reason is not justification for simply not being religious, because that's the weakness of any system. People abuse other systems, whether it be socialism or capitalism or any other public ordering of human life for egotistic reasons. The strength of religion is that it has within itself, really, as its reason for existence, sophisticated methodology for restraining the ego, something that capitalism and socialism never had, for instance. So on a level playing field, if Muslims enter those disciplines, such as banking, with the aqidah as the basic engine of their involvement, inshaAllah, then those sectors will be more successful than their secular equivalent. But if they enter them just as a career path in order to maximize profits and generate prestige, employment for themselves, then that will be the way in which they're judged, and the results may be purely material. Islam, obviously, as a comprehensive vision of human transformation, has due place for the political, and our history, in fact the origins of our history indicate that. We are very far from being apolitical. But it's also the case that whereas the Quran and the Hadith provide meticulously detailed guidance for many obligations, such as prayer, fasting, financial transactions and others, the exact process by which somebody attains and holds political power cannot be said to be covered by a large number of verses and hadiths. And as a result, there is no single Islamic political theory. There are a range of views that the Ummah has historically developed. And Imam Ghazali has one of the well-known political theories in Islam, but there are many others. The Ottomans took a different view. The Hanafi understanding is different from the Shaykh understanding. And Islamic polities historically have been ruled by a wide variety of different sorts of people. You can see that in the fact that although we revere all of the four Khulafa Rashidun, each of them came to power through a very different kind of process. And no doubt there is a sign for us in that. They were, after all, Rashidun. So in the current situation, rather than imposing a single totalitarian model of what an Islamic state or an Islamic political process has to look like, or what the agenda of an Islamic political formation or party has to be, I think we need to look at the foundations of our tradition, which is that the Sharia is about the transformation of society through the instantiation of mercy. And the basic principle there is that لا تسألوا الإمارة, do not ask for political power, which is a sound hadith, because if you ask for it, it will be given power over you. وكلت إليه, it will be given power over you. But if you are given it without seeking it, you will be given success in it. How that's to be understood depends on the political possibilities available in different cultures. And certain cultures may have a system of sultans or amirs. Some cultures might have a system of republican consultation. There are many possible models, and amongst the ulama one sees validations, complete or partial, of many of those models. What's important, I think, is not so much the actual mechanics of an Islamic political process, so much as the way in which that process guarantees a society in which ego is kept at bay and the Islamic potential of the subject is actually unleashed. Generally, the political processes in the contemporary Islamic world have produced political orders which are profoundly suspicious of religion, not just in its political manifestations, but religion as a whole. Most of the regimes in the Muslim world clearly are terrified of any sort of religion and try and keep it in its box as much as possible. They may well make large public claims to support for religion. They may ostentatiously appear at public forms of worship and maintain certain traditional symbolisms, but the reality is that the great majority of our regimes, and I'm speaking largely of the place that I know, that is to say the Middle East, the Southeast Asia I don't really know at all and have no ability to pronounce upon, but generally one finds that the regimes are phobic or allergic to the principle of religion. That has to be overcome. In Turkey recently we have seen the sophisticated reintroduction of the principle of piety into politics through the AKP and other political formations. That's one possible model of how to reintroduce ethical religion into a republican secular order. No doubt there are other possible models, but I don't think that there is a single ideology. And one of the great failings of a lot of political Islamism in the past few decades, it seems to me, has been that they have insisted in a totalitarian way that I think owes more to Western inspiration than to our own tradition, on a single legitimate vision for the relationship of faith and politics, and a consequently totalitarian view of how the state should impose right behaviour on the population. Something which it's impossible to envisage traditionally, because whereas the modern state monopolizes legislation, the traditional Muslim state doesn't legislate at all. The question of how a nation state can be Islamic is something that many of our scholars have not thought through sufficiently. Traditionally, legislation is God's as understood by the ulama, and the state plays no part in it. How that vision can be integrated into the modern system of the state, whereby the state alone legislates, and you have a legislature, which is parliament or some kind of council of ministers answerable to a monarch, hasn't been adequately dealt with. And this is a question that has appeared in various Muslim constitutional crises since the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottomans joined in 1856 the Concert of Europe, and the state increasingly assumed the role of legislator with the promulgation of the Mudawwana, which was a basically Hanafi Sharia code, which was formulated by instruments of the state, really for the first time that had happened in Islamic history. I don't think that we have thought through the long-term implications of that, or the possibility of returning to a more traditional model, whether it is possible to have, as a component in the modern patchwork of nation states, a political formation which actually strips the state of the power to legislate. I'm not sure that that's a question that has even arisen in a lot of Islamist circles, because they tend to accept the Western model of the state as having a monopolistic power over legislation. Maybe one more question.
Thank you.
Well, the situation we have in Western Europe at the moment is anomalous in that the different European Union member states have their own particular constitutional arrangement or settlement with religion. So that generally in European countries the state contributes to the maintenance of Christian places of worship, which is the case in France, for instance. All historic churches in France, the great majority of French churches are pre-1900, and hence the maintenance of those buildings is actually the duty of the state, despite the state's official secularism. And there are similar arrangements in Germany. Very often theology faculties and seminaries are supported by the taxpayers. That's certainly the case in Germany, Denmark, and a lot of other European countries. The issue is really not whether we Europeans want some American model of a radical separation, but rather whether our traditional model of state involvement in the promotion of religion should continue to promote just one kind of religion, or should promote minority religions as well. In practice in England, very often Muslim communities are supported by at least local government, in that local government very often will make subsidies available to Muslims who wish to establish mosques. And that's been frequently the case hundreds of times in particularly the north of England, where generally poor Muslim communities have had the purchase of land subsidised for them by local ratepayers and taxpayers. Whether that should become a more general national pattern is a subject of some contention. Generally, I think Muslims in England are not pressing for subventions from the British taxpayer for mosque construction, but maybe that ought to change. Whether that model is actually something that is beneficial towards religion, I doubt very much. And in terms of the idea that historically it was a duty of Muslim states to build mosques, that's certainly not one of the canonical Sharia obligations upon a ruler. If you go to a classical Muslim city and look at the names of the buildings and the Waqf documents that explain how they were founded, you'll find that occasionally the big mosque in a city will carry the name of a ruler, or will have been founded by a ruler. So the Mosque of Ibn Tulun was the Friday mosque in Cairo in the Abbasid period, and the great mosque of Samarra in Iraq. Similarly, the Umayyad mosque in Damascus was funded from the Bayt al-Mal of the Muslims. But generally, 99% of the mosques where people are praying were not founded by the state at all, but were founded by local benefactors, quite often actually local women. At least half of the mosques in traditional Middle Eastern countries were founded by waqfs that were made by women, and the same in Istanbul as well. We have to remember that the state in the traditional Islamic world actually did very little. Our vision was not quite the free market vision, but not a socialist or a dirigist vision either, in that the duty of the ruler was to defend the frontiers and to ensure that the Sharia courts operated. Otherwise, the ruler had no responsibilities or duties. Traditional rulers certainly didn't get involved in education, for instance. They might occasionally create an academy for supporting a particular view, usually for political reasons. But generally, mass education, which did exist in the traditional Muslim world, was produced from local resources and local populations. The health provision, similarly, increasingly seen as a responsibility of states, was very seldom provided by states in the traditional Islamic world. Occasionally, a great ruler might want to make a symbolic statement and build, for instance, the Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, which had a Darul Shifa, or a hospital attached to it. But overwhelmingly, that was exceptional. A few big symbolic sultanic structures might suggest that the responsibility of the state extended into social welfare, but generally we had a minimalist model of what the ruler was for. The government was basically there to make sure that the barbarians didn't cross the frontiers, and that there was a qadi who could deal with internal issues of legal boundaries. Otherwise, the sultan just stayed in his palace with his dancing girls and whatever, and everybody kind of forgot about him. And if you read, for instance, travelers' stories from the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, Marmaduke Pickthall, who translated the Quran into English, when he was only 18 or 19, travelled a lot in the Ottoman Middle East, in Syria, Palestine. And he said most Ottoman citizens at the time never engaged with the state. They just had nothing to do with it, because communities were self-governing. There would be a village headman appointed by the village itself. The qadi would come from the community, and people just had nothing to do with the government ever. And they felt very free in that. For him, travelling in the Muslim world, having been brought up in the strictures of Victorian England, highly regulated, was a kind of liberation. He, like many others at the time, experienced the Muslim world as a place of radical freedom, where communities were self-regulated and people could travel as they wished without any kind of documentation. Nowadays we have the opposite. We have a rhetoric of global freedom, but in reality everybody wants your retina scan, and the cameras following you wherever you go, and every credit card transaction is notified to some obscure central agency. And in practice we are intensely monitored, and we have, simply by the dint of the fact that there are so many laws now imposed on us, far fewer freedoms than was the case in a traditional Islamic order, where people did have a radical type of freedom. So that's a kind of answer to your question, but it's counterintuitive for a lot of modern Muslims to assume that what we want is a model of an Islamic state that dictates education, that dictates healthcare, that performs an almost socialist function. Historically, that would have been a real aberration. It has nothing to do with the traditional model of the organization of public religion. And the creation of mosques is something similar.